My ex-girlfriend and I loved traveling together. Not really any major world traveling, although I'm sure we would have if we had the time and money to do so, but more like semi-local weekend getaways. And a favorite place of ours was New Hampshire, especially the White Mountains. The places we stayed at were only a few hours away from the western suburbs of Boston, Massachusetts, where we lived, or I guess still do live. At one point, it seemed like we were up there almost once a month, especially during the summer months, but even a bit in the fall and winter too. Oftentimes we'd stay at cottages that would give you a woodsy outdoors experience, but weren't exactly rustic, as they'd have plumbing, electricity, and basic amenities. Glamping, I suppose, is the term. I've always enjoyed the outdoors, so I found them to be peaceful and relaxing trips. Even in the first year after our breakup, we still took a few trips together as friends, but by this past spring, she had started seeing someone else. So I knew our days of traveling together were over. Knowing I wasn't going to be doing any trips this summer made me kind of sad, so I decided I would still go on a trip by myself for a few nights. I briefly thought about going to one of the places we had been to before that I enjoyed, but just going on the website to check the rates and seeing pictures of the place made me sad. So I decided it had to be a new place. I browsed Airbnb for various places until I settled on a place called Trailside Stays, which actually had its own website and was a little bit cheaper to book on there than on Airbnb. It seemed similar to some of the places I had stayed at with my ex before. A cabin that I'm not even going to pretend was rustic. It actually appeared to be a repurposed trailer, which is a style not uncommon for these kinds of places. It had electricity, plumbing, heat air conditioning, basic cooking and kitchen supplies, and even Wi-Fi. There was no TV, which a lot of these places do have, but that was fine. It's not like I was going up there to stay inside and watch TV, and I could always stream stuff on my tablet if I wanted to watch something at night. It wasn't in the White Mountains, but we didn't always have to specifically stay in that part of New Hampshire, and it was still about a 2.5-hour drive from me. The site itself seemed to have a few of these cabins that were far enough from one another so you'd have privacy, and the website claimed that there were some hiking trails that ran through the site. The only downside was there weren't any natural bodies of water to swim in on site. But I did some research and found a state park with a popular lake to swim in, just a short drive away. I took an entire week off of work, but only booked the place from Wednesday, July 31st to Friday, August 2nd, figuring that 2 nights was enough for a solo trip. Ever since my ex had started seeing someone else, we weren't really able to hang out as friends anymore. Sure, we still talked on the phone a little, but not in person. And it made me realize that apart from a couple of friends that I see occasionally, my life was kind of boring and lonely. I don't hate my job, but I don't love it, and things get very slow there in the summertime. On weekends, if I don't have plans to see a friend, I tend not to do much, other than food shopping and other errands or chores around the house. So, once I had my trip booked, I was looking forward to it, thinking that getting away and being in nature would do me some good, even if it was just for a little while. I'm also a borderline stoner and have always felt that there was something right about smoking out in nature. The weekend before the trip, I began preparing and buying food to bring with me, figuring it would be easier to just buy stuff ahead of time rather than try to find a store up there. The place had a mini fridge to store perishables, and according to the website, each cottage had its own outdoor fire pit with a grill top to cook food on. Admittedly, I had never cooked food that way before, but I figured it wouldn't be all that different to cooking on the grill, which is something I do sometimes at home, and worst case scenario, if it didn't work, I could always just use the stovetop inside the cottage to cook my food. I felt cooking over the fire would also make it feel more like real camping, so I was hoping I would be able to do so with no issues. It was around this time, though, that it really started to hit me that I'd be doing this trip alone, which I was worried would make me feel weird in 2 different ways. One, I would feel sad because I would be traveling to New Hampshire without my ex for the first time, when that had been our thing. And 2, I thought I'd possibly get scared at night being alone in a cabin in the woods. While I didn't really think anything would actually happen, I decided it couldn't hurt to get a utility knife. Plus, my ex had left a small bottle of pepper spray in my car that I could also use if I needed to, although I wasn't expecting to really need either. I tried not to obsessively check the weather too much in the days leading up to the trip, but no matter how many times I checked, it kept saying there was a chance of rain for at least some of the time I would be there, most likely on my arrival date on the 31st. Finally, Wednesday the 31st of July came. Around noon, I loaded up the car, made a quick stop at Dunkin' for a late breakfast, early lunch, and hit the road. A brief downpour hit the area while I was at Dunk's, but it only lasted for about 10 minutes or so. I got hit with a few other passing showers on my drive, but all in all, not so bad. By the time I got off the highway, there were still about 45 minutes left in the drive, and I decided to stop at a gas station to use the bathroom and also take advantage of New Hampshire's no sales tax to buy a pack of cigarettes. The cashier, a youngish woman, maybe in her 20s, asked me where I was headed. Trailside Stays in Grafton County, I told her. By yourself? She asked. Yeah, I just needed to get away on my own for a few days. She gave me somewhat of a concerned look when I told her I was going alone. I asked if there was something the matter with the place, and she said something along the lines of, "No, you'll probably be fine. Just be careful going into the woods alone, and definitely don't go in at nighttime." Well, no shit. I obviously wasn't going to go into the woods at night, but I paid for my stuff, thanked the cashier, and left the store. When I got back into my car, I grabbed my phone and quickly Googled any myths or legends in the area. I saw something about a thing called wood devils that seemed like a New Hampshire version of Sasquatch. Okay, whatever, I thought to myself. Other than that, I didn't really see anything, so I thought the cashier had just been messing with me, or was maybe trying to just give general friendly advice, and carried on. By the time I arrived at the site, it was cloudy, but there were spots of sun poking through the clouds. However, I heard a rumble of thunder and moved quickly to unload the car and get everything in the cabin. After getting everything unpacked and set up, I checked the forecast, which was still calling for on and off rain for the next few hours, but it was only raining very lightly. I went outside to smoke a bowl of weed, and by 5, I decided it was fine to venture away from my site and walk around a bit. I walked around the grounds a bit, checking out some of the other sites. I could have sworn I saw at least one other car parked and someone walking around when I had arrived, but the place seemed empty as I was walking around now. It would have been too late for someone to be checking out then, since it was around 3:30 when I arrived, but maybe it had been staff cleaning up or something. There was a big trail map right in front of a trail leading into the woods, but no paper maps to bring with me, and cell service was non-existent, so I wouldn't be able to download a copy. I decided that since I had no idea where I was going, I'd just walk for 20 to 30 minutes or so and turn back. Eventually, once it was just about time to turn back, I came across a bit of a clearing where it seemed like a few different paths intersected. There were some picnic tables there, and off in the distance there were a few parked trucks at what looked to be some sort of construction site, although I didn't see any people there. I also saw at one of the tables was a windbreaker draped over the table, and a bike leaned up against it. That wasn't too weird of a sight, since a lot of these trails were considered mountain bike trails, but what was kind of weird was that there were no signs of any people in the area by the stuff. I didn't really think anything of it, though, figuring someone must have left it to walk somewhere, and they'd be back. And that ultimately, this didn't affect me one way or another. I decided to sit at another table for a few minutes, where I had a few hits of a joint I brought with me, before heading back the way I came. As I was walking back, I heard a strange noise off in the distance behind me. I wasn't sure if it was a car from a nearby road or some sort of animal like a coyote or fox or something. I kept hearing it every now and then, and it seemed like it was either consistently the same distance behind me or possibly even moving closer. I still wasn't sure what I was hearing, but moved quickly and eventually made it back to the Trailside Stays grounds. As I walked back to my site, I did see there was another car parked at the site across the road from mine. I noticed the light was on in the cabin, and I saw what looked to be a couple staying in there, but that was it for other people there. It was very humid out, and it doesn't take much to get me to break a sweat, so I was dripping with sweat when I got back to my cabin and just rested and cooled down for a bit. I checked the forecast again and saw another band of rain was supposed to come through the area for a bit. I was a bit skeptical since the rain hadn't been much so far, and I went outside to get the materials ready to get a fire started. However, as I was doing that, the rain started to get consistently more steady. Not a major downpour, but definitely more than a light drizzle. I decided to wait a bit to see if it would let up before I got the fire started. It eventually did stop a little less than an hour later, but by this point it was about 8 and I was losing daylight fast. I got the fire going and eventually got my food cooked, but it involved a bit of fumbling around in the dark. Once my food was cooked and eaten and I got stuff put away, I was able to just sit and relax by the fire with a joint and a beer, and thought about making s'mores since I brought the stuff to make them with me. As I was sitting there, though, I started hearing noises again. First, I had been hearing noises coming from the site across the road from mine, but saw their cabin had the lights on, so I just figured they were outside having a fire too. At one point, I thought I heard a scream coming from there, but didn't hear any other sounds of panic, so I figured maybe someone saw a freaky bug or dropped something on their foot, and there was nothing unusual going on. However, I was also hearing something coming from the woods that sounded like what I had heard on my walk earlier. I still thought it was probably just some sort of animal, but the sounds were getting closer, and I started hearing rustling coming from other areas, and they weren't coming from the cabin where the other couple were staying. As my fire died down, it seemed like the noises were getting closer to me. I started feeling uneasy, so I made sure the fire was out completely, gathered my things, and went inside the cabin, where I locked the door and drew all the shades. As I sat inside the cabin, I listened to hear if there were any more noises coming from outside. The cabin itself made some noises of its own, being a repurposed trailer with an artificial plumbing hookup, and I also heard what I'm pretty sure were bugs bumping up against the windows since they could tell the light was on. I didn't hear anything else though, so I decided to watch something on my tablet for a while before I went to bed. A short while later, I heard the noises from the woods again and thought I was hearing footsteps outside around the cabin. I was feeling a bit uneasy, but figured I was safe inside the cabin and didn't bother to look out, still thinking it was just an animal. Occasionally, I would hear what sounded like something moving around outside or even bumping up against the cabin, but I was eventually able to get to sleep around midnight, albeit with my tablet still playing some music for background noise. I slept through the night, maybe waking up once or twice, but getting right back to sleep both times, and eventually woke up for good around 8 in the morning. I didn't see anything unusual or out of place outside the cabin, and there were no signs of anyone having been there the previous night. I sat in the chair by the fire pit as I had a wake and bake and a cup of coffee, and thought that it must have just been an animal I heard last night, or even my mind playing tricks on me. After all, being alone in the woods at night can get spooky, and the fact that I had recently been binge-watching a bunch of Mr. Ballen videos didn't help. Now that it was daytime, though, the area seemed peaceful and relaxing again. I made some breakfast, and then got my stuff ready to head to the lake I was planning on going to that day. After a nice, somewhat scenic drive, during which I discovered a good classic rock station on the radio that's better than my local one, I made it to the lake, which was pretty packed, but luckily I had reserved parking ahead of time. I spent a few hours there, during which time I went for a swim, had some lunch, and walked around a bit before heading back. When I got back, though, I noticed the couple staying at the other cabin had apparently left. It's not like I had even said hi to them, so I wasn't going to be missing their company or anything. But still, it was comforting to know that there was someone else nearby if something were to happen to me. Since it was still relatively early, I decided to take another walk in the woods before thinking about getting the fire going, which would be done much earlier tonight since there was no threat of rain. I started walking down what I thought was a different trail than the one I had done the previous day, but quickly realized it was the same trail, and I was just starting from a different entry point. Not wanting to do the same walk again, I decided I'd try walking a ways in the other direction. However, after not too long, I saw the path was leading uphill and had some steep turns designed for the mountain bikers. I decided I wasn't up for doing a steep uphill walk and just went back. As I was making my way back to the site, though, I once again heard the same noise from the day before. This time, it sounded like a roaring/growling noise for sure. Definitely had to be some sort of animal. I still thought coyote was a possibility, but was wondering if maybe it could be a black bear or even a mountain lion. It sounded closer to me than it did the previous day I was in the woods. I had my knife and pepper spray on me, but didn't really think they'd do me any good against a large predator. As I was approaching the sign saying that I was back on the property of Trailside Stays, I heard quick footsteps that sounded like they were right behind me. I turned to look and saw just a blur of something moving behind a tree. Whatever it wasn't a bear. This happened at least 2 more times. I would start to walk, hear scurrying behind me, but see either a quick blur dart away or nothing at all. I was getting a bit freaked out, but once I crossed the makeshift fence that separated the property from the rest of the woods, it stopped, and I heard nothing. It certainly felt like something was following me through those woods for a few minutes there, but was apparently leaving me alone now that I had crossed this invisible line and exited the woods. I sat outside for a bit, smoking some more weed, before getting the fire started around 6:30 or so. Things were pretty uneventful for the next few hours. I cooked my food over the fire again, although I still managed to undercook the meat a bit, cleaned up a bit, and made a couple s'mores. Around 9, the sky started getting dark enough for the stars to come out. It had been too cloudy the previous night, but since there wasn't much light pollution in the area, the star coverage was great. I even saw a few shooting stars and one that lit up the sky for a second. I sat out by the fire stargazing for another hour or so, having an occasional joint or cigarette. I was trying to keep the fire going for as long as I could since I had used up all the wood from that night's bundle and didn't want to have to pay for another one. However, after doing all I could to keep it going, it inevitably began to die down. Once the fire had basically just become embers, I was considering staying out to look at the stars a little while longer, when all of a sudden I heard that same animal-like roaring noise, and it sounded like it was coming from just beyond the tree line surrounding my campsite. If that was the same thing that had followed me in the woods before, but was too afraid to cross the line dividing the Trailside Stays property from the rest of the woods, it was no longer afraid to do so now. I quickly made sure the embers were out completely, grabbed everything that was still outside, and went in. I heard the noise again as I was getting inside, and I once again immediately locked the door and drew all the shades. I decided to take a shower to calm me down, and also because after the last 2 days, I probably smelled like a combination of sweat, dirt, bug spray, soot, and lake water. While I was in there, I heard what sounded like something banging against the bathroom portion of the cabin, but I wasn't sure if that was from something outside or just the water system making noises. After getting out of the shower, though, it sounded like there were scurrying footsteps moving around the site, and I heard the roaring sound once more. I had no idea what was out there, and frankly, I didn't want to, since I still felt safe inside. Sleep was a bit harder to come by this night, as whenever I thought what was out there might have left, I would hear more movement coming from outside, although I didn't hear the roaring noise anymore. I just let my tablet play random YouTube videos for background noise as I lay in bed. I eventually drifted off to sleep around 1 or 2 a.m. When I woke up, it was light out, and I checked the time to see it was a little after 8 in the morning again. When I opened the shades, though, I saw that stuff outside had been completely ransacked. Granted, I hadn't left any personal belongings out there, but the table, chairs, and fire pit had been knocked over or even flipped completely upside down in the case of the picnic table. I went outside to investigate further and also noticed the bin that the firewood was kept in had been gone through. I don't think any kind of animal would be capable of doing all that. I guess maybe a bear could have, but I hadn't left any food or anything out there that would attract them, and I don't know why a bear would go through the trouble of rooting around a bin with nothing but packaged bundles of firewood along with the other fire tools. As a courtesy to the people who run the place, and so I wouldn't get blamed for it, I cleaned up to the best of my ability, although I didn't flip the picnic table back over, and I don't think I could have by myself if I tried. I decided that whatever was out there clearly wasn't happy with my presence, and since I was leaving that morning anyways, I quickly packed up my car and headed out a couple hours earlier than I was planning to. As I was making my last trip to load up the car, I heard the roaring noise again, and it sounded like it was right behind me. I turned around and once again saw something quickly dart behind a tree again. I wasted no time in getting the last of my stuff into the car and got out of there. When I got home, I tried to do some research into what it could have been that was stalking me through the woods and made a mess of the campsite. It didn't fit with the patterns of any animals that live in the area, and I once again came across the wood devils. I looked a little bit more into them and discovered they're not exactly the New Hampshire Sasquatch. Apparently, they're these tall, thin, and hairy creatures that live in the woods of New Hampshire. They supposedly try to avoid human contact by hiding behind trees or even just standing perfectly still, hoping they won't be spotted. They also will let out loud screams when humans get too close to them. That sort of sounds like what was following me in the woods, although what I heard sounded more like a feral roar than a scream. It also seems like they mostly try to avoid humans, so I'm not sure why one would follow me and ransack my campsite. Maybe I got too close to its territory, and it was trying to send a message to me to leave that area. It also seemed like it felt more comfortable getting closer when it realized I was the only one staying there that second night. I'm not convinced it was definitely a wood devil, since one, it seems like most reported sightings have been slightly north of where I was staying, and two, I'm not convinced these things definitely exist. From what I've gathered after some internet research, they're pretty obscure, and even locals don't know a whole lot about them, with the most recent alleged sightings being in the 90s. Surprisingly, though, and now that I've had a few days to think about it and calm down, this hasn't necessarily deterred me from going back to New Hampshire. I know something followed me in the woods and tried to destroy my campsite, but other than that, I mostly enjoyed my trip. It's not like anything that bad actually happened to me, so I might do another one in the future, but maybe with a friend, and/or in a more crowded place, since whatever it was that followed me in the woods back to the cabin seemed to have no problem going after me when it was clear I was the only person in the area. I don't know if it wanted me for food or just wanted me to leave, but it's probably for the best that I didn't find out.